Welcome to the latest Straight Up Hangout. This week we'll be talking about question marks, the null-coalescing operator. And this week we have with us Michael Rogg from Top Shelf Craft and Matt Stein from Working Concept. I'm Ben Perusic from Barrel Strength Design. And our topic, Twig's null-coalescing operator, has been a recent newcomer to the scene in the Twig world. It's been around a lot longer in various other programming languages, and then it snuck its way into PHP 7 recently, and then through a handful of events ended up in Twig. And I guess it's safe to say even that it might have better support in Twig now than PHP, because you don't have to worry about what, as long as people are running the latest version of Twig in the application, such as Craft, you can use it everywhere. And where in PHP you'll have to ensure they still have the server running PHP 7. So what is the null-coalescing operator? It's a fancy name for a fairly simple and practical thing. It's an operator that we use in our conditional statements that helps us say a mouthful in just a few characters. It basically says, and I quote, I don't quote yet, basically says, give me the first thing that is defined and is not null in our conditional statement here. So we'll pull up a screen share here and start showing a handful of examples.
Yeah, so the null-coalescing operator is also a lot of times in other languages called the logical defined or, which actually those words make a lot more sense in describing what the operator does. It looks at the thing on the left, and if that thing is defined, meaning the variable exists and the variable's value is not null, then it gives you the thing on the left, and then if not, then it looks at the thing on the right. And if that thing is defined and not null, it gives you that thing. And if neither of the things is defined and not null, then it gives you null. So you go through the list, and for each thing you say, is this defined and not null? If so, give it to me. If not, move on.
Great. All right, so let's take a look. This is probably clearer to start showing some code and compare it to our words. All right, I've got just a simple, the home page of Happy Logger set up here, and I'm just editing in the template if we want to check any of these conditionals. But some of these are just going to be code examples. So here's our old school statement. It's an if statement, and we have something that I've just titled variable here. And we say if variable is defined and if a variable is not null, then we'll output that variable. Otherwise, we'll output something else. And it's a fairly readable conditional statement, but it is, 5 lines of code there, and it can get more complex than that as well. So one common step we'll take when we have certain versions of this type of statement is we might update this to use the ternary operator. And the ternary operator is a shorthand version of this longer statement, and we can essentially do the same thing. We have a first part of this that says if variable is defined and variable is not null, then we use this question mark and say output the variable, and then we use a colon and then say output the fallback. So the question mark colon syntax is the syntax of our ternary operator, and it lets us simplify a longer if statement into a shorter one. But it comes with some trade-offs of readability sometimes too, where it can get complex and sometimes. Our final option, which we'll be sharing here, is Twig has a default filter. So we can shorten what we're doing here with our ternary operator even a little bit more, and we can do something like this, where we have our variable, and then we run it through the default filter, and if the variable doesn't exist, it falls back to our fallback text. Now I think that default filter is behaving a little, all of these are a little, I think some of these things are a little bit different. The default filter is checking if it's undefined, and then the documentation says it's also checking if it's empty. And so I think the default filter, if we were to translate the default filter into this longer form if statement, it wouldn't be is not null, it would be is not empty. And empty is a handy condition that Twig adds that checks if something is null, but it will also check if it's an empty array or a few other things as well. And so if you don't know exactly what you might be getting back, empty casts a little bit wider net to try to determine if something exists or not. All right, so before we reveal how the null-coalescing operator, our double question marks, can make this a little easier on us, I'm going to take this a step farther and say, what happens when we are testing two variables? Because this is when a lot of these statements all become a little more messy. So what happens if we have a variable and some other variable? Well, here we go. We have even more code in our first example to try to determine the same thing. And we'll pull up a copy of our ternary. Our ternary conditional can do the same thing, but we'll see that we start getting pretty verbose and hard to read here as well. We're checking for our first variable. If it exists, we output it. Then we start checking for our other variable, and then we output it. Typo. And then finally, our default variable, if we have our variable, pass it through the default filter, we can fall back to a default of another variable, but if we want to make sure it exists, we will have to pass it through another default filter. And again, we've kind of got this increasingly complex string of code to parse and make sense of. All right. Any thoughts so far, folks?
In your if statement, I think you might want to move the big chunk of nested if statements into the else.
Ah, correct.
There you go.
There we go. All right, so there we have our, oh, this is wrong. All right, perfect. There we go. Now we've corrected what we don't want to do. So here we are with our growing code base, more complexity, and we're wondering how we can simplify things. And we've heard of this null-coalescing operator, so let's start exploring how we can use that. The null-coalescing operator allows us to have a variable and add two question marks and then our fallback. So these above statements, and I'll get rid of these more complex ones for now. These more complex statements can become as simple as checking our variable name using the double question marks and then providing our fallback. And it's doing the same thing as this 6 through 10 code up here. If variable is defined and variable is not null, then we output the variable. Otherwise, we're falling back to fallback. So that's pretty handy. And we can continue down this path if we go through our other variable. We just have to add it right in there too. So again, we've taken that even larger block of code that we were just looking at and simplified it to a pretty readable conditional statement. And that's it. We're done.
I happen to think that's beautiful.
That was easy.
All right. So, yeah.
No, I assume we can set these things as well.
Set things.
So if I was going to reuse this variable throughout the template, could I set it equal to? Okay.
Yes. So if you wanted to, exactly. I'll leave that. Set new variable equal to. Yes.
Cool.
So you can set that, and this is a nice way too that you can set the variables that you're passing into this as well, so that this conditional statement becomes very readable at the end of the day too. So yeah. So from here, I have a few other examples of kind of taking this and going farther. Just kind of looking at other scenarios we'll likely run into. So here's an example of, well, we could do this without a variable. We could just pass a blank string in and see if it exists or not. Well, this is going to return true. This isn't going to get hit by. This isn't going to return the blank string doesn't exist. This is going to return blank because the null coalescing operator is checking if it's defined and not null, and our string gets read as something that exists. And we have a comment from Peter that says, "I wish I'd known this a year ago." And Peter, I think you still would have been out of luck in Twig until a month or two ago, I think, when Michael released the first version of this in Twig as a craft plugin. And then it later got picked up by the Twig core. So it was only till the last couple months, I believe, that this was an option here, unless you were using Perl or C++ or something. All right, going farther, we can start. Sometimes we have things that exist in our template. So here we might have an array of data of some sort that we've defined in our template, and we can use our null coalescing operator to try to see if something exists in it. But again, we're kind of going to run into that same situation as the string here. The array variable is defined, so we could be checking for that. But if it's in the array, it's not going to be null. It's going to be there in some way or another. So our conditional is going to pretty much work as expected. So this will return true, I guess I should say. And then we could have another situation where we are trying to test for that array, but it doesn't exist for some reason. Maybe we have some fake array that we haven't defined in our template. Here, this is going to return false. So we're going to get our fallback message here.
We should say that the first one returns the string hello, and the second one returns the string fallback.
Yes. There we go. All right.
Annoying, but it would be lowercase hello too. I mean,
yeah. Well, because we shouldn't. It's best if we don't say true and false, because neither true nor false is actually null, and so it is true that the 0th item in array is defined and not null, and it is false that the 0th item in fake array is defined and not null. But the actual return value is going to be either the item that is defined and not null, or the return value will be null.
Got it. So then Michael, I believe I read in the docs that, so if we have, I'm going to just make this a little more complex. So maybe I switch it. Anyway, so we can have multiple null coalescing operators happening here. And one of the things the docs say is it's an ideal way to do a conditional like this because the underlying code only does a check for each of these things once. Whereas if you do conditionals in some other ways, like with the ternary operator, the underlying code might actually be checking for something multiple times. Could you explain what that means?
Yeah, sure. That's less probably important in Twig specifically than it is, well, less important in Craft specifically than it is just in regular PHP when you're doing a thing. But let me pull up some code here, and I will talk about why that matters. All right, so I will share my screen here. Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Yeah. All right. Can you see that clearly enough?
Yes.
Get a little bit bigger. Okay. So let's say I have a method that is going to do a big query. So a big query method. Okay, so now I want to assign the return value of that method to some variable. So in PHP, I might say the variable foo is equal to big query method. Let's say I'm going to use my ternary operator. You know, big query method either returns to me something or it returns false. And so in my ternary operator, I'm first checking to see whether this method returns to me something that is truthy. And if it does, then I want to display that value. And if not, then I'm going to display a fallback. Well, the problem with this is that BigQuery method is going to be evaluated twice. First, when PHP is deciding whether it returns something truthy, and the second time to actually return that value and assign it to my variable. Right. So if this is running a thing that takes a lot of system resources, I obviously don't want to run it twice. And this is even true if I shorten this to the Elvis operator, which is the nickname for a ternary operator without the middle argument that basically says if this method returns something truthy, then use that value, and if not, use the fallback. Well, under the hood, PHP is still evaluating that method twice. Once to decide whether it has a truthy value as its return in the first place, and the second time, to go ahead and make that variable assignment. By contrast, if I have it return a null value to represent the fact that it doesn't have a value, which is more semantically correct, right? Because false or 0 or an empty string, these are all actual values that have meaning, right? So null is the value that we use in programming to mean this thing doesn't have a value at all, right? So if I use a null return and then I use the null-coalescing operator, then PHP is only going to evaluate this method once, and it will save its value the first time that it checks to see if it's null. And so it's basically like saying, let's see, foo equals a equals that is defined and not null. That's my great PHP syntax there, right? And if so, then return that value that I just captured, and if not, then return the fallback. Right? So it's the first time the null coalescing operator evaluates an operand, that value gets cached, and if it needs to be returned, because it is not null, then it returns that sort of inline cached value without needing to reevaluate the operand to return its value. That was a lot of words, but did they make sense?
Yeah. And so in Twig, what if we were checking, say, an entries variable for length or something like that, where
Right. So the reason then that it's not as important in craft is that craft is pretty smart. And so if, for example, I said something like craft.entries big section with many entries and absolutely no limit on it, so this is just gonna be a query that takes forever, right? And then we're gonna return the first thing in that section, right? And if not, then I return my fallback if the first thing in this section doesn't exist. Well, craft, the first time I run, I fetch this element criteria model, and then I look to see if it has a first item. Craft is going to cache the result of that query inside the element criteria model, and so anywhere I subsequently reference this element criteria model, I'm going to get the cached value, unless I change an attribute which would break that internal cache. I'm going to get that cached value, and so craft is sort of taking care of that nicety for us. If it weren't, then I would have to do something like I would have to say set a variable and then do something like that, so that I'm not recalculating that variable every time. But craft takes care of that because of the way it does lazy loading and internal caching.
Okay, even in the context of the ternary operator there, if it was doing that.
Right.
Okay.
Well, because from Twig is just passing these things straight through to PHP, because Twig is compiling its templates down to straight PHP, and so the PHP under the hood of something like this is calling this method, whatever this method looks like in PHP. It is calling it twice. If you use that in the ternary operator, like if you we're expecting something not null, like a total, and you use the Elvis operator like this. That is functionally equivalent to that. Right? So PHP is actually calling this operand twice if you use the ternary operator, but craft is taking care of caching its value so that it doesn't run all those queries the second time.
Got it.
So that is a nicety that craft gives us, but if you were writing this stuff in regular PHP or using the null-coalescing operator in any other language, then you would be responsible for grabbing that value the first time you evaluated it, and then using that sort of in your own personal copy of that value.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's a lot clearer. All right. Great. Well, I have a couple more simple examples here. So I'll share my screen again. All right. So I just wanted to kind of run through a couple other examples of what we run into in templates. Another thing we might find in our templates is a multi-dimensional array, or what Twig calls a hash. And again, we have the same type of syntax that we can run here. We can check if that an item in that multi-dimensional array exists, and if it does, it'll return that value. And we can test for a multi-dimensional array that doesn't exist, and that will give us our fallback. All right, then we get into kind of the one that requires a little more awareness in craft, is what happens when we start interacting with our objects in the template, such as our element models. And here we have our entry title. So here we're checking to see if an entry exists, entry title exists, and falling back to a fallback. Well, our result here is going to be the entry title, and that's good. So then we might say, well, we have a custom field. What if we do the same thing with our custom field? We'll say we're testing for a custom field that exists, and that's great. We're going to get back our custom field, text, or whatever it gives us. And so both of these statements are returning true to the first value we're passing them, and at this point we're convinced that we're doing everything right and that there's nothing around that's going to stop us. And then we test for something, we test for another custom field that doesn't exist, and what happens? But we get an error. And this happens because of the way that custom fields work on element models in Craft 2. This might not be an issue in Craft 3, but because custom fields are so dynamic, the element model is going to try to check if it's there, even if it's not, and effectively think that it might be there. And then it's not going to have anything for your template, and you're going to get an error. If I clean up everything here, I can save and refresh, and we'll see that we get the error entry model and its behaviors do not have a method or closure named our custom field that doesn't exist. Now, the easy way to solve this is when we're dealing with things with our custom fields. Rather than using dot syntax, we can update this to be array syntax, and if I reload now, you'll see we get our fallback back, because by using array syntax, the underlying element knows that it's something that needs to either exist or not exist. That's the simple version of it.
Yeah, when you use that array syntax, you're taking advantage of the fact that that model implements the array interface, and so what that's actually doing under the hood is going to craft to that object magic getter method, which is going to return the value if it exists and actually return null, I think, if it doesn't exist. Is that right? That the magic getter returns null for a variable that doesn't exist?
I don't know.
It's in your table.
Oh, yeah, the table. Yes, if anybody is working on it, I do have my table up here. This is a resource on Straight Up Craft that goes through all of these different scenarios and shares what's going on. So let's take a look. Here are our objects. So here's something that doesn't exist. Is this the right one, Michael? So I guess this is set up to
right. So
I think I'm missing the detail of the question that makes me know what to look for here.
Well, okay. So yeah, in your array syntax, the answer to is it defined is false, and incidentally, the answer to is it not null is also false, right? And so that's what the null-coalescing operator is asking is it defined and not null? And so if you use that array syntax to try to get at an attribute that doesn't exist, then the null coalescing operator will see that it is not defined, and it'll move on to the next operand.
Got it. Yeah, and the error we're seeing here is this scenario right up here where we're trying to access a non-existent attribute, and it's returning true for the defined part and then throwing an error for the is not null part and giving us back an error.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah, so the takeaway there is if you know that the handle you're checking is a custom field that you have defined in Craft, then you can safely use the dot syntax. But if you are not sure that that attribute is going to exist, then you should use the array syntax so that you don't accidentally throw a template exception. So I guess a practical example of when that might happen is, if you're looking at entries, right? An entry technically has the attribute even for fields that aren't assigned to it. So if I have created a custom field in Craft and I have then it is that field won't throw an error if I check for it on an entry in Craft. But maybe I am checking a variable that might be an entry, or it might be a matrix block. Well, the fields that I define globally in Craft aren't available to the matrix blocks. Each matrix fields are defined separately from the global field groups, and so I don't necessarily know. If I don't know whether that object is an entry or a matrix block, then I don't know whether that attribute is available and might throw an error, and so then I should use the array syntax. It just comes down to how confident are you that the thing after the dot is not going to throw an error.
Yeah. Great. Well, that's like the one big warning I have in the null coalescing, which is the same warning as doing conditionals anywhere else. So that's kind of the range of my examples. If either of you have any others you want to throw on the table, I'm happy to draw them up here.
Yeah, well, I guess I would point out that you've talked about one-dimensional variables, but the null coalescing operator in Twig, since it is the same basically as checking variable is defined and variable is not null, will also work several layers deep on a multi-dimensional value. So, for example, maybe I have
like a custom matrix field with a table in it or something.
Yeah, maybe like maybe I have craft dot entries. So this is a what I'm going to call a multi-dimensional variable because first is a property of the entries, the element criteria model that entries gives me, which itself is coming from the service that is accessible to the Craft global variable, right? And so if I use the null coalescing operator, then what I'm really interested in is whether the value of the first method returns a value or whether it returns null. But the fact is, if for whatever reason entries didn't exist or Craft didn't exist, then Twig would still be smart enough to know that that this evaluates to something that is not defined. And so, maybe I say set foo equals.
Can you make the font size a bit larger, Michael?
Here, font I've never been in presentation mode in PHP Storm before. Anybody know how to do that? My trusty Command plus doesn't do it.
Yeah, I think it's like a weird hotkey and scrolling in PHP Storm, if I remember correctly.
I don't know if I can help you there.
I'll Google it if you.
Let me see. Is it in my preferences? Appearance. Yes.
Presentation mode. View, enter presentation mode.
Yeah, I'm in presentation mode. And dang it.
Hold shift and scroll, Selvin suggests.
Control plus mouse wheel, if you've enabled it.
Could you just move your camera closer to the screen, maybe?
Hang on a sec. Okay,
There
how's
we
that?
go. There we go.
That's lovely.
Alrighty. So let's say I am going to set foo to, A is something, and B is something else. So now if I say, foo dot doesn't exist, obviously that's going to give me my fallback because the key doesn't exist in this particular hash. But what is even cooler is that if I change this, and I'm not going to get an error trying to check for this key on a hash that doesn't exist because the hash doesn't exist in the first place. And so I can go as many levels deep as I need to. Right? And Twig will see this whole big blob of stuff, and if any part of it doesn't exist, then it's still going to evaluate that it is not defined, and so the null-coalescing operator will skip it and move to my fallback. And where that is an advantage is over something like, if I did this in an if conditional, then Twig would throw an error if I had my dev mode enabled, and so Twig strict variable checking was enabled. Then Twig is going to throw an error if any part of this doesn't exist. And so the null-coalescing operator is just a little bit more nuclear in that way, that if just any part of the thing doesn't exist, you just get a nice, quiet, okay, great, I'm moving on to the next operand. And so where that comes in handy is maybe I'm going to check. I do this a lot with things like themes on a site. If a site has themes that maybe can get defined in an entry, but then that falls back to a group theme, which falls back to a global default, which falls back to something in the template, right? So I might say, entry color falling back to active theme color, falling back to the default theme color. So maybe this is some other element that I've defined elsewhere, and this is a global set element, and then if all else fails, then the color is black, right? Mm-hmm. And so this is presumably an entry model. This is another entry model. This is a global set model, and any of these things may or may not be defined or may or may not exist. And so it doesn't matter whether or not the color property on each of these exists, because what gets checked first is whether the root object, the parent object, exists. And so the null-coalescing operator is a lot more powerful in that way than doing stuff with even the default filter or the ternary operator, because those are still going to throw an error, if any part of what you're trying to access doesn't exist. So if I tried to, for example, let's say I use default filter, right? Well, the default filter will see the first bit, and if it doesn't exist, we'll fall back to the second bit. But if the second bit doesn't exist, then you're still going to get the same big ugly, exception that gets thrown, because ultimately, the ternary operator and the default filter are still looking to have a value in the end. Whereas if I use the null-coalescing operator, then even if neither of these things exist, this expression still has a value, and its value is null. And so Twig is not going to throw an error.
So if active theme.color doesn't exist, we get a null back. We don't get an error?
That's right. Yep. So that's equivalent to null.
I think Marion mentioned last week that your plugin and the Twig implementation behave a little differently on that final value. One returned null and one returned an error. I don't recall which was which.
So the QQ plugin definitely returns null if if all of the operands are null or not defined. If the Twig implementation is doing something different, then that's a bug.
Yeah, actually, I'm getting it. Yeah, if I test just variable QQ, other variable, I get a variable, other variable doesn't exist. Error. Rather than a null. So in the craft implementation, you'd have to have a final question mark null at the end if you wanted to get a null back, it looks like.
Huh. All right. Well, then you have uncovered a bug somewhere that needs to get fixed. Because
Marion, we'll give credit to Marion on that.
The definition of the null-coalescing operator says that if all of its operands are undefined or null, then the value of the expression evaluates to null.
Okay. All right. Well, somebody will open that bug report, and I'm sure it will be you. If
I imagine it will be me in about 5 seconds.
Yeah, if you just test exactly what you have there and make sure that active theme.color doesn't exist, you'll see you get a template error.
All right. Well, for posterity, by the time that people watch this, assume that somebody fixed the bug and you can do it correctly.
All right. Great. All right. Well, if there's any more question marks out in the audience, please post them. And if not,
I feel like this stuff is so hard to talk about because we just keep saying the same like the words null just over and over and over again.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to track. It's like a tongue twister.
Yeah, when you get in a complex template, it takes a while to figure out the exact logic you need because you're dealing with a handful of things with different values that you got to sort out.
I have 2 questions. One, I think you said this in the beginning. What version of this, if I've been lost at sea and just got back and I want to check my craft installs and see if I can use the null-coalescing operator, what version of craft introduced this?
I believe 2.6, I'm guessing.
I think it was it 2.6?
I'd have to look.
I thought it was before that. Let's look at the changelog here. I remember we talked about it on Keeping Up with Craft.
Yeah, it might have been.
It was 2.6.2771 updated Twig.
Cool.
It was the 1.24 branch of Twig, I think, that implemented it in core. And then Craft updated its internal copy of Twig in 2.6.
Cool. And then on the other end of this, it's obviously very exciting. Is there the possibility to get overzealous with your null coalescing operators? Is there an example where you've just gone too far and made your life more difficult?
Well, you you can't be too overzealous with the null coalescing operator if what you want to do is coalesce values that are either null or not, right? And so there are cases where the values that you are dealing with, may be a value like false or a value like an empty string. And in those cases, it might be more appropriate to use something like the default filter, to fall back to a value that is not empty. The default filter is basically, if the null coalescing operator is the logical defined OR, the default filter is the logical empty OR, right? And so you have to kind of make sense of which of those tasks you are actually interested in performing. Like, what question are you asking about your content, and what value do you want it to return to you in the end? And so you can never be too overzealous with the right solution. You just have to, match the solution to the question that you actually are asking. And in that case, it's what value do I want to get back? So for example, in Craft, like if you're dealing with a color field, the native Craft color field, if it's not set, actually returns an empty string. And so you couldn't use that with the null coalescing operator, which actually I had to build a color picker that let you have null values for exactly that reason. And so you have to know for each piece of content that you're checking, what is it doesn't exist state. Does it actually not exist, or is it null, or is it empty, and then use the right operator for the content.
And you had one more, Matt?
No, that was it. That was both. I got them both in there really quickly.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Great. All right, then. I think we've made it to the end. Question mark, question mark. These two characters are now your friends in Craft and Twig here. And we hope you can simplify your code, make it more beautiful, and make everybody using it more happy.
Amen to that.
Thanks for coming out today, folks. Next week we'll be off. We'll be down at Peers Conference in Florida, and the week after we'll be back. Topic undetermined at the moment, but we'll get it up on the site. Have a great day.
Cool. Have a great weekend, y'all.